The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when the girl stumbled into camp. Her feet, torn and bleeding, left dark stains on the frost-covered grass. The women gathering water from the stream saw her first. They dropped their buckets, the sound of spilling water drowned by their gasps. The girl's dress hung in tatters. Purple bruises bloomed across her arms like terrible flowers. Her face, swollen and discolored, barely resembled the vibrant young woman who had left 3 days earlier to gather herbs in the hills. Swift Hawk, daughter of a respected warrior family, collapsed before she reached the center circle. The women rushed to her side, wrapping her in warm blankets, speaking soft words that seemed to pass through her like wind through an empty lodge. Her eyes stared at something far beyond what anyone else could see. When they tried to help her stand, she flinched from their touch as if their gentle hands were weapons. Blood matted her long black hair. Scratches covered her neck and shoulders. The marks told a story that no one wanted to read. News spread through the camp faster than prairie fire. Mothers pulled their daughters close. Fathers gripped their weapons with white knuckles. The elders emerged from their lodges, their weathered faces grave with understanding. They had seen this before, in other times, with other daughters. Chief Standing Bear heard the commotion from his lodge at the far end of camp. He was a man of 60 winters, his braided hair now streaked with silver, his face carved by years of leading his people through joy and sorrow alike. When he stepped outside and saw the cluster of women surrounding a figure on the ground, his blood turned cold. He walked with purpose toward the gathering crowd. People parted before him, their eyes speaking what their mouths could not. When he saw Swift Hawk lying there, trembling despite the blankets, despite the warmth of the women trying to comfort her, something ancient and fierce awakened in his chest. He had known this girl since her birth. He had celebrated her first steps, blessed her naming ceremony, watched her grow into a young woman of remarkable spirit and intelligence. She had been learning the healing arts from the medicine woman. She had a laugh that could brighten the darkest winter day. Now that light had been extinguished. Standing Bear knelt beside her. His joints protested, but he ignored them. He spoke her name gently, as a grandfather would. Her eyes, vacant and distant, slowly focused on his face. Then the tears came. They streamed down her bruised cheeks as her body shook with sobs that seemed to tear from her very soul. The chief placed his hand over hers, careful not to startle her, offering silent strength. Around them, the camp had gone quiet. Even the dogs had stopped barking. The morning birds seemed to understand that their songs were unwelcome. The medicine woman, Old Willow, pushed through the crowd. She carried her healing bag and a bowl of water mixed with sacred herbs. Her ancient eyes assessed the situation with the efficiency of someone who had tended to countless wounds over 8 decades of life. She began cleaning Swift Hawk's injuries with practiced gentleness, her lips moving in silent prayers. Each bruise revealed was another knife in the heart of those watching. Each cut was another crime demanding answer. When Old Willow finished her initial examination, she looked at Standing Bear. Their eyes met, and in that moment, a lifetime of shared understanding passed between them. The medicine woman gave a barely perceptible nod. The chief's jaw tightened. His hands, resting on his knees, curled into fists. He had led his people through conflicts with rival tribes, through harsh winters that claimed the weak, through government agents who spoke with forked tongues. He had negotiated treaties and broken bread with enemies to secure peace. But this violation of one of his own people, this assault on an innocent girl under his protection, ignited a rage that he kept carefully controlled beneath his calm exterior. Standing Bear rose to his full height. Though age had bent his back slightly, he still commanded presence. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the entire camp. It was not loud, but it held the weight of absolute authority. Every person present heard his words clearly. He declared that justice would be found. He promised that whoever had done this would answer for their crimes. He swore on the sacred memory of his ancestors that Swift Hawk would be avenged. The people responded with solemn affirmations. They trusted their chief. They believed in his word. What they did not yet know was just how far Standing Bear would have to go to keep his promise. Swift Hawk did not speak for 2 full days. She lay in Old Willow's lodge, staring at the smoke hole in the ceiling, watching the sky change from dawn to dusk without seeming to register the passage of time. The medicine woman tended her injuries with poultices made from yarrow and sage, wrapping her wounds in clean cloth soaked in healing tinctures. The physical damage would mend, Old Willow knew. The wounds no one could see would take much longer. Perhaps they would never fully heal. On the 3rd morning, Swift Hawk finally found her voice. It came as a whisper, hoarse and broken. Old Willow leaned close to hear. The words tumbled out in fragments, pieces of a nightmare that Swift Hawk had to reassemble in order to share. She had been gathering medicine plants near the old creek, the place where the best healing herbs grew in abundance. The sun had been warm on her shoulders. She had been thinking about the upcoming harvest celebration, about the new dress her mother was making for her. Then she had heard horses approaching. 3 white men had appeared on the ridge above her. They wore the rough clothes of trappers or prospectors, their faces hidden behind unkempt beards. She had tried to run, but they had been faster. Their laughter still echoed in her memory, cruel and mocking. They had chased her like hunters pursuing wounded prey, enjoying her terror. When they caught her, they had shown no mercy. What followed was a horror that old Willow absorbed in silence, her aged face remaining calm even as her heart broke for this young woman she had helped bring into the world. The men had spoken English among themselves. Swift Hawk understood some of the language from trading post visits. They had called her vile names, treating her as something less than human, something to be used and discarded. When they were finished with their terrible sport, they had laughed again. One had suggested killing her. Another had said no one would care what happened to an Indian girl anyway. The third had agreed to let her live, apparently finding amusement in the idea of her walking back to camp in shame. They had ridden away, heading west toward the mining settlements. Old Willow held Swift Hawk as the girl wept again, her small frame racked with sobs. The medicine woman felt the weight of all her years pressing down on her shoulders. She had seen the worst of humanity during her long life. She had witnessed the smallpox epidemics that decimated villages, the forced removals, the broken treaties, the casual cruelties inflicted by those who saw her people as obstacles to progress. But each new atrocity still had the power to wound her spirit. She stroked Swift Hawk's hair and sang an old healing song, one her own grandmother had taught her generations ago. When Standing Bear came to the medicine lodge that afternoon, Old Willow met him outside. She told him what Swift Hawk had revealed, leaving out none of the painful details. The chief needed to know everything if he was to pursue justice. His face remained impassive as he listened, but his eyes blazed with controlled fury. When Old Willow finished speaking, Standing Bear thanked her and walked to the edge of camp where he could be alone with his thoughts. The chief stood looking out at the vast prairie, watching the grass bend in waves beneath the wind. He thought about his responsibilities to his people. He thought about the treaties his father had signed, promises made to avoid bloodshed. He thought about the soldiers at Fort Laramie who would not care about Swift Hawk's suffering, who might even blame her for being in the wrong place. He thought about the delicate peace that could shatter so easily, bringing violence down upon his entire village. And he thought about the girl who had smiled at him just 4 days ago, that smile now broken perhaps beyond repair. That evening, Standing Bear called a council of the warriors and elders. They gathered in his lodge as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. 20 men sat in a circle, their faces illuminated by the central fire. The chief explained what had happened, his voice steady despite the anger burning in his chest. Some of the younger warriors immediately called for revenge. They wanted to form a war party, to track down these white men and exact justice with blade and arrow. Others, older and more cautious, worried about the consequences of such action. Gray Fox, a warrior of 50 winters who had fought in many battles, spoke with the voice of experience. He reminded them that the army would use any act of violence as an excuse to push them from their lands. He spoke of other tribes who had retaliated against white criminals only to face destruction from soldiers who cared nothing for the original crimes. He urged caution and careful consideration. Several other elders nodded in agreement, though their faces showed their distaste for such passive response. But Standing Bear had already made his decision. He would not lead a war party against the 3 men. That would indeed bring disaster upon his people. Instead, he would do something that required even more courage. He would go to the white man's law. He would ride to Fort Laramie and demand that the soldiers bring these criminals to justice. He would insist that the treaties, which promised equal protection under the law, be honored. He would force the white authorities to acknowledge that Swift Hawk's suffering mattered, that her life had value, that justice was not only for those with pale skin. The council erupted in debate. Many thought this plan was foolish, that the white man's courts would never punish their own for crimes against Indians. Others admired the chief's determination to seek justice without bringing war upon their village. Arguments flew back and forth across the fire until Standing Bear raised his hand for silence. When he spoke again, his words carried finality. He would leave at dawn. He would take 2 witnesses with him. And he would not return until he had secured justice or proven beyond doubt that the white man's promises were worthless. The council reluctantly agreed, though many feared they would never see their chief alive again. Standing Bear rose before dawn, as he had done for 60 years. The camp was still wrapped in darkness, the stars brilliant overhead in the clear autumn sky. He prepared himself carefully, choosing his finest ceremonial clothing. This was not vanity but strategy. He would present himself to the white authorities as a leader deserving of respect, not as a supplicant begging for scraps of mercy. His buckskin shirt, decorated with intricate beadwork his late wife had crafted years ago, spoke of dignity and tradition. Eagle feathers, earned through acts of courage and leadership, adorned his graying braids. 2 men had volunteered to accompany him. Red Cloud, a warrior of 40 winters known for his intelligence and skill with languages, would serve as translator and witness. Many Horses, an elder of 65 who had witnessed the signing of the original treaty, would lend the weight of his years and memory to their cause. Both men understood the danger they faced. Fort Laramie represented the heart of white military power in the region. Indians who came there with complaints often left with nothing but broken promises and wounded pride. Some never left at all. Before departing, Standing Bear visited the medicine lodge one final time. Swift Hawk was awake, sitting up for the first time since her ordeal. Her bruises had faded slightly, turning from deep purple to ugly yellow-green. Her physical wounds were healing, but her eyes still carried that distant, haunted look. The chief knelt beside her, taking her hands in his with gentle care. He promised her that he would seek justice, that what happened to her mattered, that she had done nothing to deserve this suffering. Fresh tears streamed down her face as she nodded, unable to speak. Old Willow watched from the shadows, her ancient eyes gleaming with unshed tears of her own. The 3 men rode out as the sun broke over the eastern horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. They traveled light, carrying only essential supplies. The journey to Fort Laramie would take 4 days of hard riding. Standing Bear set a steady pace, conserving the horses' strength for the long miles ahead. They rode in contemplative silence much of the time, each man lost in his own thoughts about what lay ahead. The landscape rolled past them in endless waves of grass punctuated by occasional stands of cottonwood trees. They saw herds of antelope bounding across the plains, their white rumps flashing in the sunlight. Hawks circled overhead, riding the thermal currents in search of prey. The beauty of the land stood in stark contrast to the ugly purpose of their journey. This was their home, the territory their ancestors had roamed for generations beyond counting. Now white men crossed it freely, taking what they wanted, acknowledging no law but their own desires. On the second day, they passed a wagon train heading west. The emigrants stared at them with expressions ranging from curiosity to fear to outright hostility. Standing Bear kept his face neutral and his hand away from his weapons. Any confrontation here would doom their mission before it began. The wagon master, a sun-weathered man with suspicious eyes, rode out to intercept them. Red Cloud explained in English that they were traveling to Fort Laramie on peaceful business. The wagon master seemed skeptical but allowed them to pass without incident. Standing Bear could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following them until they were well out of sight. That night, they camped beneath a sky so full of stars it seemed the heavens had shattered into countless glowing fragments. They built a small fire and ate dried meat and pemmican. Many Horses spoke of the old days, before the wagon trains and the forts, when the only whites they saw were occasional trappers who knew how to respect the land and its people. He spoke of the first treaty councils, of the promises made by men in blue uniforms who claimed to represent a great father in a distant city. Those promises had seemed sincere at the time. Many Horses had believed them. Now he knew better, but he still hoped that some shred of honor remained in the white man's system of law. The third day brought them into rougher country. They climbed through pine-covered hills where the air grew cooler and thin. Standing Bear's aging body protested the long hours in the saddle, but he showed no sign of discomfort. A chief did not complain about such things. They encountered a cavalry patrol that afternoon, 5 soldiers led by a young lieutenant who looked barely old enough to grow a proper beard. The officer questioned them sharply about their intentions. Red Cloud explained again, his English perfect and polite. The lieutenant seemed inclined to turn them back, but an older sergeant quietly advised him that Indians had the legal right to bring grievances to the fort commander. Reluctantly, the young officer allowed them to continue. As they made camp on their third night, now within a day's ride of Fort Laramie, Standing Bear felt the full weight of what he was attempting settle upon his shoulders. He was leading his companions into the heart of white authority with nothing but faith in a system that had repeatedly proven itself unjust to his people. He was trusting that men who viewed Indians as inferior beings would somehow honor their own laws when those laws demanded justice for an Indian girl. He was betting everything on a principle that might exist only on paper, meaningless in the real world where power and prejudice reigned supreme. But what choice did he have? To do nothing would be to accept that Swift Hawk's suffering meant nothing, that his people could be violated with impunity. To seek revenge through violence would bring the army down upon his village, resulting in far more death and suffering. This third path, this attempt to hold the white man to his own stated ideals, might be foolish. It might end in humiliation or worse. But it was the only path that offered any hope of justice without bloodshed. Standing Bear fed the fire and watched the flames dance against the darkness. Tomorrow they would reach the fort. Tomorrow he would learn whether the white man's law was real or just another broken promise. Fort Laramie sprawled across the valley like a small city. Wooden palisade walls enclosed barracks, stables, storage buildings, and the commander's headquarters. The American flag snapped in the autumn wind above the central parade ground. Soldiers in blue uniforms went about their duties with practiced efficiency. Civilian traders, scouts, and suppliers moved among the military structures. The fort served as the administrative and military hub for hundreds of miles of territory, the place where treaties were signed and conflicts supposedly resolved through civilized negotiation rather than violence. Standing Bear and his companions rode through the main gate under the watchful eyes of sentries. A sergeant approached them, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. Red Cloud explained their purpose in clear English. They had come to report a crime and seek justice through proper legal channels. The sergeant's eyebrows rose in surprise. Indians typically came to the fort seeking trade goods or treaty negotiations, not to file formal criminal complaints. He directed them to tie their horses and wait while he consulted with his superiors. They waited for over an hour in the autumn sun. Soldiers passed by, some staring openly, others pretending not to notice them. Standing Bear remained perfectly still, his face composed, though inside he wrestled with rising frustration. This waiting was a demonstration of power, a reminder of who held authority here. Finally, the sergeant returned and led them to the commander's office, a sturdy log building that served as the administrative heart of the fort. Colonel Marcus Thornton was a career officer of 4 to 5 years, his uniform immaculate, his graying mustache precisely trimmed. He had served on the frontier for 2 decades, participating in numerous campaigns against various tribes. He viewed Indians with a mixture of professional respect for their fighting abilities and paternalistic condescension regarding their capacity for civilization. When the 3 Lakota men entered his office, he did not rise from behind his desk. He gestured for them to stand before him like subordinates reporting to a superior. Red Cloud translated as Standing Bear spoke. The chief recounted Swift Hawk's ordeal in clear, unflinching detail. He described her injuries, her testimony about the 3 white men, their direction of travel, and their approximate description. He invoked the treaty agreements that promised equal protection under the law. He demanded that the army pursue these criminals and bring them to justice. As he spoke, Colonel Thornton's expression remained unreadable, his fingers drumming slowly on the desk surface. When Standing Bear finished, silence filled the office. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying the 3 men before him. He had dealt with countless Indian delegations over his years of service. Most came seeking food during harsh winters, or complaining about treaty violations by white settlers, or making demands they had no power to enforce. This situation was different and more complicated. What the chief described was clearly a serious crime. The colonel had no doubt that the assault had occurred. Such things happened with disturbing frequency on the frontier. But pursuing justice in this case opened a multitude of problems. The colonel began speaking, his tone measured and formal. Red Cloud translated his words. Thornton acknowledged that if the crime occurred as described, it was indeed a serious matter. However, he explained, prosecuting white men for crimes against Indians was extraordinarily difficult. There were no witnesses beyond the victim herself. The perpetrators had apparently fled into the mining territories where hundreds of rough men came and went constantly. Finding 3 specific individuals based on a vague description would be nearly impossible. Even if they were found, getting a jury to convict white men on the testimony of an Indian woman was unlikely. The legal system, he said with what might have been genuine regret, was not designed to handle such cases effectively. Standing Bear listened to the translation, his jaw tightening with each word. This was exactly what he had feared. The colonel was preparing to do nothing, hiding behind excuses about legal difficulties and practical impossibilities. The chief began to speak again, his voice rising slightly with barely controlled anger. He pointed out that the treaty explicitly promised legal protection. He noted that the army had no difficulty pursuing Indians accused of crimes against whites. He demanded to know why Swift Hawk's suffering was considered less important than the suffering of white victims. Why did the law only work in one direction? Colonel Thornton felt a flash of irritation at this challenge to his authority. He was accustomed to Indians accepting his decisions without argument. But something in Standing Bear's bearing, in the controlled fury burning behind his eyes, gave the colonel pause. This was not a man easily dismissed or intimidated. Moreover, Thornton was not entirely without conscience. He had a daughter not much older than the victim. The thought of what had happened to Swift Hawk stirred uncomfortable emotions that he usually kept locked away when dealing with Indian matters. The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the parade ground. He thought about his orders from Washington, which stressed maintaining peace on the frontier at all costs. He thought about the newspaper reporters who occasionally visited the fort, looking for stories. He thought about his own career and reputation. And he thought about the simple question of right and wrong, a question that had become increasingly complicated during his time on the frontier. After a long moment, he turned back to face Standing Bear. Thornton made a proposal. He would send out a patrol to investigate the crime scene and search the nearby mining camps for the three men. If they could be located and there was sufficient evidence, he would have them arrested and brought to trial. However, he warned, the chances of success were slim. The chief would need to provide Swift Hawk's detailed testimony. She would need to be prepared to identify the men if they were found. And Standing Bear would need to accept that even if everything went perfectly, justice might still not be served due to the prejudices of the civilian court system. Standing Bear considered this carefully. It was less than he had hoped for but more than he had realistically expected. The colonel was at least willing to make some effort, even if he clearly held little hope for success. The chief agreed to the terms. He would bring Swift Hawk to the fort to provide her testimony, though the thought of asking her to relive her trauma for the benefit of skeptical white authorities made his heart heavy. They would cooperate fully with the investigation. In return, the colonel would make a genuine effort to find the perpetrators and bring them to trial. As they concluded this uneasy agreement, Colonel Thornton felt an unfamiliar sensation. It might have been respect. Standing Bear had come here not with weapons but with an appeal to justice, trusting in the very system that had so often betrayed his people. That took a different kind of courage than battlefield valor. The colonel extended his hand across the desk. After a moment's hesitation, Standing Bear took it. The handshake was firm but held no warmth. It was merely a formal acknowledgement of their agreement, a fragile bridge across a vast cultural divide. 6 weeks after Standing Bear's visit to Fort Laramie, a military patrol returned to the fort with 3 prisoners. The soldiers had tracked the men to a mining camp 200 miles to the west, identifying them through persistent questioning and Swift Hawk's detailed descriptions. The arrest had nearly sparked a riot among the miners, who viewed the soldiers' actions as a betrayal of white solidarity. Only the presence of 20 armed cavalrymen had prevented violence. Now the 3 men sat in the fort stockade, awaiting trial in a civilian court that would convene in 10 days. The news reached Standing Bear's camp like thunder across the prairie. Against all expectations, the army had actually found the men. Swift Hawk's attackers would face justice. The camp erupted in cautious celebration. Women sang songs of victory. Warriors danced around the evening fires. But Standing Bear remained measured in his response. The men were captured, yes, but they had not yet been convicted. The real test still lay ahead. When the trial date arrived, Standing Bear led a delegation of 20 people to Fort Laramie. Swift Hawk rode among them, her face composed but pale. She had agreed to testify, understanding that without her voice, the men might go free. Old Willow accompanied her, providing quiet support. The journey took 4 days, and with each mile, Swift Hawk's anxiety grew. She would have to face her attackers. She would have to recount her ordeal before a room full of strangers. She would have to endure their stares and judgments. The trial took place in the fort's largest building, hastily converted into a makeshift courtroom. A judge had traveled from the territorial capital specifically for this case. 12 white men sat in the jury box, their faces ranging from sympathetic to hostile. The 3 defendants sat with their lawyer, a clever man from Denver who had already begun arguing that the case rested on unreliable testimony from a savage who probably misunderstood what had happened. Standing Bear and his people were allowed to observe from the back of the room. Swift Hawk took the witness stand with Old Willow beside her for comfort. Red Cloud translated her testimony from Lakota to English. She spoke in a quiet but steady voice, recounting every terrible detail of that day 6 weeks ago. She described the men's faces, their clothes, their horses, the words they had spoken. She pointed to the 3 defendants, identifying them without hesitation. As she spoke, some jury members looked uncomfortable. Others remained stone-faced. The defendants smirked and whispered to each other, showing no remorse. The defense lawyer attacked her testimony viciously. He suggested she had consented and later regretted her decision. He implied that Indian women had loose morals and could not be trusted. He argued that these hard-working white men were being persecuted based on the word of someone whose people were known to lie and steal. His arguments played on every prejudice and stereotype his audience held. Standing Bear watched from the back row, his hands gripping his knees so tightly his knuckles turned white. Several warriors had to be physically restrained from rushing forward. Colonel Thornton testified about the investigation, presenting physical evidence his men had gathered. Swift Hawk's torn clothing, found at the scene. Descriptions from witnesses who had seen the three men leaving the area that day. The testimony was professional and thorough. The prosecutor, a young attorney appointed by the territorial government, did his best to present a compelling case. But everyone in the room could feel the tension, the unspoken question that hung in the air like smoke. Would a white jury convict white men for a crime against an Indian? The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Standing Bear and his people waited outside in the autumn cold. The sun set and rose again before the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding a piece of paper that would determine whether justice was real or merely a beautiful lie. The judge asked for the verdict. The foreman's voice rang out clear in the silent room. Guilty. All three defendants, guilty on all charges. The crime had been proven beyond reasonable doubt. The courtroom erupted in chaos. The defendants shouted their outrage. Their supporters in the gallery screamed about injustice. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. The three men were sentenced immediately. 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison. They would be transported east under military guard within the week. As soldiers led the convicted men away, one of them locked eyes with Swift Hawk. The hatred in his gaze was pure and venomous. But for the first time since her ordeal, Swift Hawk did not look away. She met his stare with her own strength, reinforced by the knowledge that he had been held accountable. Outside the courthouse, Standing Bear stood surrounded by his people. Tears streamed down many faces, including his own. They were not tears of complete joy, for nothing could undo what Swift Hawk had suffered. But they were tears of recognition that justice, however imperfect and however rare, was possible. The white man's law, when forced to honor its own principles, could acknowledge that Indian lives mattered. This single victory would not change everything. It would not stop future crimes or eliminate prejudice. But it was a crack in the wall, proof that the impossible could sometimes be achieved. Swift Hawk stood beside the chief, old Willow's arm around her shoulders. She would carry her scars forever, visible and invisible. But she also carried something new now, something that had been born in the moment of that guilty verdict. She had been heard. Her pain had been acknowledged. Her truth had been validated by the very system designed to ignore people like her. That knowledge could not heal all wounds, but it could provide foundation for rebuilding a shattered spirit. As they prepared for the journey home, Colonel Thornton approached Standing Bear one final time. The two men stood facing each other, representing worlds that rarely found common ground. The colonel spoke quietly, for Standing Bear's ears alone. He admitted that he had not believed justice would be served. He had expected the jury to acquit despite overwhelming evidence. But something had shifted in that courtroom. Perhaps it was Swift Hawk's courage in testifying. Perhaps some jury members possessed more integrity than expected. Perhaps the clear evidence had simply been impossible to ignore. Whatever the reason, the colonel acknowledged that Standing Bear's faith in seeking justice through legal means had been vindicated. Standing Bear accepted these words with a simple nod. He did not thank the colonel, for the white man was merely doing what should have been done without hesitation or praise. But he recognized the significance of what had occurred. The journey home would take 4 days, and during those days, Standing Bear would have time to consider what this victory meant for his people's future. The white man's world was coming whether they wanted it or not. Learning to navigate that world, to use its own rules and systems to protect their people, might be as important as any warrior skill. Swift Hawk had staggered into camp broken and brutalized. She was leaving Fort Laramie with her dignity restored and justice served. That transformation, painful and hard won, represented a kind of hope that Standing Bear had not dared to imagine when he first knelt beside her bruised and trembling body 6 weeks ago. The story would be told around campfires for generations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and persistence could still bend the arc of history toward justice.